Good morning. Today I'd like to introduce Rick Zdan. Rick is a professor in sociology at RIDA. He is also on the planning and zoning board for Rahway. Last month we heard about the Habitat project in Summit. Today we're going to hear about some less amicable projects in Rahway. Rick.
All right, so I guess my first order of business is I'm expected to nominate someone new to join the organization. Well, first things first, I want to thank, there we go, I'm a little bit too tall. Yeah, we're good, thank you. Yeah, first, I want to thank a couple of people. First of all, Eric Hasker for reaching out to me about a year ago and inviting me to come and address you all today. To Paul Tukey, who spoke with me yesterday about making sure we had all the AV arranged. And particularly to Mike Bennett for his long-suffering efforts to extract information about this talk out of me. I operate under sort of a university time schedule, which a colleague of mine describes as it's not actually due until you're told it's late 3 times. So anyway, and also I do want to thank all of you for welcoming me here today to address your organization. Let me pop this up. I have there we go. And there it is. Yeah. So when Eric approached me about speaking with you guys, one of the things that he suggested that I might be interested in discussing is this so-called Pine Street project in Rahway, New Jersey. And as I sort of thought about it a little bit, I started contextualizing some of what I do in my one life as a zoning commissioner with what I do in my other life as a sociologist, thinking about community organization, social movements, mass mobilization of people, and the way that we come to represent ourselves and develop these understandings for who we are and construct our identity in this social context. And what came out of that is the talk that I'm gonna try to make my way through today. I'm aware of the time. We're running a little bit late, so I'm going to try to move a little bit quicker than I otherwise would have in the interest of oh no, I'm told I don't have to do that. Okay, well that's the case. Then I'll take my time. But in any case, I guess the first thing that I want to preface this entire talk with is the issue of what is it exactly that sociologists do. And to start that off, my father was a police officer. He was on the job for over 40 years. And when I was growing up, his big thing was always having common sense. Right? Anytime you did something where you weren't really thinking about it, say, what are you doing? Don't you have any common sense? And apparently when he was in a leadership position, he eventually retired as a captain, his officers would get the exact same treatment that his sons would get. Where one of these officers would do something and he'd say, well, what are you thinking? Don't you have any common sense? Until finally, one officer, he was the first Puerto Rican officer who was hired onto the force. And he responds to my father when he says, he's like, well, Cap, Puerto Ricans have a different kind of common sense. And, my father thought about that for a minute. And he's like, well, that makes a certain amount of sense. What does common sense mean anyway? Right? Common sense is what we all take for granted. This sort of folk wisdom about the way that the world is supposed to work. Now, one of the things that we do as sociologists, so I guess in some way I'm my father was a little bit more influential on my course track than he may realize. What we do is we examine a lot of these things that are conventionally common sense ideas. There's so many things in the world that we look at in our daily lives and we say, well, of course it works that way. It's common sense. Well, but what does that mean, right? What does it mean to say something is obvious, it's overt, it's common sense? So I'm going to come back to this as we move through a little bit and talk a bit about this project. So, see how I'm. There we go. So, I suppose if we're going to talk about zoning projects, we have to start with Euclid v. Ambler, which was a Supreme Court decision that was decided in 1926. Now, the village of Euclid, Ohio, was a suburb of the city of Cleveland. And the folks who lived there were very concerned about creeping industrialization out of Cleveland, starting to contaminate the character of their community. There we are. Sorry about that. The idea of this creeping industrialization contaminating the character of their community. So in order to, quote, maintain the character of the village, Euclid established a code of zoning laws, a set of ordinances that were intended to restrict what individuals could do with their property, what sorts of uses different properties could be put to. And a company called Ambler Realty immediately sued Euclid over this because they made the argument that this was a violation of their due process rights. Right? They owned property within this village. And now all of a sudden, they're being told they cannot monetize this property in the most effective way for them. So this makes its way all the way through the court system. There's a series of appeals, gets decided one way, it gets decided another. The details are not really important until we get to the final arbiter, and that's the Supreme Court. So in 1926, the Supreme Court held in Euclid v. Ambler that there is in fact a valid governmental interest in maintaining the character of a neighborhood. Right? They argued that the Euclid zoning ordinances were not discriminatory, and there was a logic behind them. They were not just being enforced by fiat. Right? So, excuse me, based on the precedent of the ability of municipalities to use police powers to eliminate nuisances. Right? When we think about nuisance laws, you think about maybe somebody who's got music that's too loud playing at 11:30 at night. Right? The police have the ability to show up at that property and say, turn down the music, you're disturbing your neighbors. Right? These folks are doing what they want on their property, but there are restrictions on their ability to do that if it impacts other people. And that's what these zoning laws are based on. This Supreme Court decision wound up leading to an explosion of similar ordinances in municipalities all across the United States, from villages all the way up to cities. Most of the United States most of the United States has some form of zoning ordinance governing what people can and cannot do with their property. Houston is actually one of the more notable exceptions as a zoning-free community. Right, so any Texans, you want to you want to expand your house, you want to build all the way up to the property line, you want to put a skyscraper on your little 25-foot lot, go for it. You can do whatever you want. Now, that having been said, in the city of Rahway, the way that Rahway does zoning is based on the original Euclid model. Right? It's a hierarchical Euclidean model, if I'm being specific about it. But Rahway has 4 different residential zones within the community: low density single family, medium density single family, low rise multifamily, and high rise multifamily. Now, the reason why I have 2 of these bolded here on this slide is those are really the 2 that are going to be relevant to what we're going to discuss today regarding these projects. In the R2 medium density single family residential zone, and that's a mouthful, the stated goal in the ordinance is to maintain and strengthen the single family character of the zone, except as provided for. Right? Now, within that R2 zone, accessory apartments, and here's the important thing, 2-family dwellings or multiple family residences are not permitted. Right? This also means you cannot have townhomes, you cannot have condominiums, you cannot have apartment complexes, because again, the purpose of this ordinance is to maintain this single family character in the community. Now, the R3 low-rise multifamily residential zone is where you would go if you wanted to develop something that would be a little bit more dense. So the idea here is to encourage the establishment of moderate density multifamily uses. These would comprise low-rise or garden apartments. By ordinance, these can have a maximum density of 20 units per acre. And townhomes, which again, by ordinance, can have a maximum density of 10 units per acre. Now, what exactly is an acre? By virtue of the fact that we do not live in Oklahoma, this is a word we do not get a lot of use of in our daily lives. So for context, an acre is approximately 75% the length of a standard football field. Right. Now, bear in mind your standard football field, you got to include the end zones, right? So it's 120 yards, right? So 360 feet, right? You take about 3/4 of that, and that's your acre. So in these low-rise and garden apartment complexes, you can have 20 units of residential housing within 3/4 of a football field. And if you're talking about condos, you can have 10 units of residential housing in 3/4 of a football field, right? Y'all with me so far? All right, that's what I like to hear. All right, now, what if you don't want to do that? And this is sort of where, the city of Euclid, or the village of Euclid, excuse me, was able to get around some of these discriminatory or by fiat arguments. They said, hey, if you want to do something that's not permitted, it's not a problem. There is a process in place where you can go before a zoning board of adjustment and you can say, hey, I need an exemption from these rules for reasons, right? You can't just say, I want to do it just because. And there are 2 different types of variances, right? These opportunities to get relief from zoning for which one can apply. The first is a use D variance, and this is as articulated under the New Jersey Municipal Land Use Law. Right? The use D variance is necessary when you're seeking a use that is not otherwise permitted. So if we go back to that last slide and we're thinking about these R2 residential zones, let's say you want to convert a home. You just purchased this house, it's a little bit run down, and you're thinking, it's too big for me to sell. I'm going to break it up, turn it into a 2-family, and then put it on the market because somebody might want to buy it as a mother-daughter. They might want to buy it as an investment property. Well, you can't do that in an R2 zone because use is prohibited. But you can go before the zoning board and you can make your case. Right? This is why this is something that is important or necessary for us to do. And there are certain burdens that you have to meet as an applicant. You have to be able to explain to that board why there are special reasons why you need to get this exemption, right? But you also need to explain how this can not only be reconciled with the city's master plan, but also you have to illustrate that there's going to be no negative impact on the surrounding community, right? You're going to make sure that you're getting a break, you're getting to do something different, but you're not negatively impacting anyone. Now, that's the use variance. The other one is the idea of a bulk C variance. And if you as a homeowner have ever gone before zoning to apply for a variance, that's probably the one that you needed to get. The bulk C variance is necessary when you want to violate zoning rules related to how far the structure has to be set back from the boundaries of the property. You want to put an extra story on your house and you want to get the roof line a little bit higher than it otherwise should be. When you've got a little bit too much lot coverage or you've got too much impervious coverage on your property, that's where you would go for that bulk C variance. And again, Same thing applies here. There are criteria. You've got to show either that there's some particular hardship, right? That your property is just weirdly shaped. Maybe you live in an old community. Rahway actually dates back. It was originally originally settled in the 18th century. So there's a lot of properties that predate these zoning ordinances, right? There's a lot of strange sized properties that are undersized compared to today's standards. So if you wanted to do anything on those properties, you can say, hey, I have a hardship. I can't abide by these rules and still be able to make any sort of changes to my home just because the property is strangely sized or shaped. Right? The second thing is there's this idea of a flexible bulk variance justification that you can use, where you don't really necessarily have a hardship, but it's obvious that the benefit of you doing so is going to dramatically outweigh any detriment of violating these rules. All right. Finally, again, with the C, you still have to prove that there's no negative impact on the people in your community. So again, you've got the opportunity to do things a little bit different, but you have to go through the process and you have to follow the rules. So this brings us to Pine Street. And as you can see on this slide, there's sort of the before picture of what was there on this spot. The Pine Street project is not really an existing building. It's not a lot per se. Pine Street is a paper street. It exists on maps, but it was never actually built. The parcels that are involved are forested. There were approximately 3 parcels of land that were involved in this, plus the street that was never actually created. So it is a wilderness space. The 3 parcels that were involved combined, plus the paper street, come out to approximately 1.13 acres. Right? So that forested area that you're looking at there in that picture, that's less than the length of a football field in depth. All right. Now, what was proposed is that. As you can see from the architectural schematic that was submitted with the application. The developer for this project wanted to construct 3 buildings of townhomes with a total of 14 units, 5, 5, and 4. Again, on a parcel that is less than the size of a regulation football field. In addition to these units, they were going to construct the street that never actually got paved. Right? So that's what's planned. Now, if you break out these 14 units by the size of the parcel, you find that they're proposing a density of 11.5 units per acre. But what is a unit? Right? What is a unit of housing? Does it make a difference if it's some tiny little Cape Cod that has 2 bedrooms, or if it's some huge McMansion that's got 5 or 6 bedrooms in it? I mean, both of them are units of housing, right? So when you're thinking about density of people, one of the things that you also look at is the number of bedrooms that you have in these individual units, because that's going to give you some idea about how many actual people are expected to be living in these structures. So based on the number of bedrooms proposed in each of these units, you come out to 37.17 bedrooms per acre. So you're going to have, assuming 1 person per bedroom, which is totally a reasonable assumption, right? You're going to have just under 40 people living in a geographic space that's about 3/4 the size of a football field. Right? That's the density of what's being proposed in this particular project. And so the Pine Street application was first proposed, it was first scheduled to be heard by the board in November of 2020. It finally wound up being heard by the board on April the 19th of 2021. So there was a period of time where this was carried over for about 4 months. And The public was aware of it. There was discussion about what was going on. People would show up for meetings. They'd be told, it's not going to happen. Meeting's going to be next week. We're going to talk about this application. So the developers took their time in actually having, preparations made for the hearing. Now, contrast this to Elm Avenue, also in the city of Rahway. Elm Avenue represented the renovation of a vacant Victorian home that had actually at one point, for the last 50 odd years, been home to a funeral parlor. Home sat on about a third of an acre, and they wanted to convert this into a 5-family home. All right. Now think about this for a second. 5 families living on that 1/3 of an acre. And again, you can see this is a photograph of what that house looks like. I mean, it's a very nice house. You put some money into it, that could be a beautiful showpiece, right? Obviously, it had previously been a funeral home, so there was some work that would have to be done to maybe with the basement area. And certainly your market value of selling a former funeral home, if you want to turn around and flip it, you might not get the same thing you get for something that hadn't been a funeral home. But, excuse me, the idea was to turn this into a 5-family home. In order to do this, the building would have to be expanded, as you can see from the plans. It seems that what they attempted to do was staple a giant 3-story shed to one side of the building and call it done. But this was the proposal. Again, just like with Pine Street, this was originally proposed about 4 months before it finally wound up being heard. This was first appeared on the schedule for the board in May of 2022. It didn't actually end up getting heard until September the 19th, 2022. So again, you've got 4 months where anybody who is interested in engaging with these applications is waiting. They're being dragged along. But the density on this one is even greater than what we were looking at on Pine Street. In this particular case, you're looking at 16.47 units per acre and 43.33 bedrooms per acre. Right? So this is a lot. Now, for comparison, in 2022, so as of last year, these are the most recent statistics we have available. The median single-family home in the state of New Jersey sits on a lot that is 0.23 acres, right? And it has 3 bedrooms. And again, median, for all those of you who are not statistically minded, right? It's not the average, it's the middle. You line all the properties up in a row, that's where you land. What this does is it helps us control for outliers, right? You're not dealing with, the Springsteen estate down in Rumson, right? And calling that 1, right? So we take the median measure. So 0.23 acres, 3 bedrooms. So based on this, we calculate this out over a full acre. The standard home the standard single family homes, in the state of New Jersey, you wind up having 4.34 units per acre, right? So about 4 families living in that 3/4 of a football field. Compare this to Pine Street, which is 11.5, and Elm Avenue, which is 16.47, right? You see exactly how much above that standard these proposed units are, right? This is a significant increase over what we would normally expect to see in single-family homes. And again, this is a zone that's restricted to single-family homes. When we look at bedrooms, we see something similar. You're going to see an average of 13.04 bedrooms per acre, right? Standard single-family homes in the state of New Jersey. And you see how those numbers increase to give you a little bit of context on what these 2 developers are proposing. Now, what do you think, folks? If you lived adjacent to Pine Street, if you lived on Elm Street, is this something you'd be happy to see in your community? No way. I hear somebody who said maybe. Well, maybe is actually sort of an interesting answer, because I guess the part of the question becomes, what was there previously? Right? I mean, yeah, if you've got this old dilapidated building, maybe you might want to have something put there, but maybe you might even be willing to compromise with a 2 or 3 family home. But you might think 5 is a little bit excessive. All right. If you're living adjacent to where this Pine Street project is going to be built, you might be happy to see some of those woods knocked down. Less mosquitoes, that kind of thing. Right? That was actually what somebody testified to as far as why they were happy to see the woods go. So you might be okay with that, but you also might want to see maybe not 14 units put on that piece of property. 14 3-bedroom units. 14 3-bedroom units, all of which had an office in addition to the 3 bedrooms, which was totally not a 4th bedroom. All right. So this is what's being proposed. Now, again, Pine Street doesn't seem that terrible, especially when you look at it in comparison to Elm, but I've only told you part of the story. All right. There was another problem with Pine Street. Approximately 50% of that acre was designated as freshwater wetlands or a wetlands transition area. Now, because it was an undeveloped lot, right, there was nothing there but trees and dirt. Dirt, last I checked, is a pervious substance. And the benefit of having trees is that they tend to absorb water. If you cut down the several dozen mature trees on that property and you replace them with approximately 2/3 of the surface being covered in something impervious, whether this is the tarmac of the road itself, whether this is the roofs of the houses, sidewalks, whatever it may wind up being, you're going to have a real impact on what happens with stormwater runoff. Now, obviously, the developer for Pine Street did propose some sort of a retention system, but there is this difference between having this natural wetlands area that's doing this job versus trying to come up with some sort of manufactured alternative solution. Now, from the Rahway Environmental Commission, all of our various commissions give reports on these applications, and this is an actual quote from the report that they submitted. Actually, the person who signed off on that report is another one of your members, Mr. Jeff Robinson, who I actually saw on Zoom today. But in any case, the report reads, "Flooding is a real danger. Homeowners on adjacent Wall Street should be concerned." Right. So I don't know. Now, maybe, I don't know if Pine is still a little bit better than Elm, whether it's now worse, what we sort of want to do with this. Again, show of hands. If you're living in the vicinity of these projects, how many people are totally cool with having these developments, who want to see these buildings get constructed? And let the record show. Oh, wait, is that a hand in the back? You, sir. Why are you excited to see these developments down the street from you? Let me repeat the question, or the statement that was made by the person, the gentleman in the audience. The gentleman said that in the state of New Jersey, it's not reasonable to take a median lot size because you have a lot of dense urban areas, right? And you've got, Sussex County, where I think that there's like 4 homes. However, I would actually argue that while I do respect that it's not an ideal measure, and had data been available that was a little bit more precise for single family homes in urban areas, I certainly would have provided that. The fact that, one, we are looking at single family homes. Right? We are leaving out condos, we are leaving out apartments, we are leaving out attached homes. That eliminates some of the more dense types of structures that you're going to encounter in urban areas. Second, I'm taking a median. So instead of averaging out some sort of tiny little urban footprint lot with some sort of vast estate down in Gloucester County, we're lopping off all those outliers and we're just looking at the meat of what's in the middle. It is an imprecise measure, but it's not a worthless measure. I would take issue with that, right? That having been said, with the exception of the one hand from the audience, I think everyone else here physically in the room would not be thrilled about having this construction taking place down the street from them. So what happens? The Pine Street application is approved. The hearing goes on for hours, but it does eventually wind up getting approved. Elm Avenue, on the other hand, is withdrawn in the middle of the hearing. The counsel for the applicant comes up to the board and says, yeah, we want to reconsider this. We want to pull our application and we'll think about resubmitting somewhere down the line. So why? Why do you see these differential results? And I would argue that the key reason why you see these different results for these two similarly dense development applications is neighborhood engagement, right? And I think that it's wonderful that you guys are reading Bob Putnam's Bowling Alone, because a lot of what Putnam talks about is sort of relevant to some of the things that I want to try to touch on in this talk today, right? Putnam makes the argument that community engagement has been declining fairly precipitously from the 1950s towards 2000 when the book was published. He's reconsidered some of these ideas in some of his later work, but the general principle still remains. People are out there, they're still doing things, but they're not really engaging with their community. Now, what we saw here was an example of the kind of thing that Putnam talked about in the case of the Pine Street application. There were 2 neighbors that attended the hearing. None of them spoke out against the application. Right? One of them actually lived on Wall Street. That street that the Rahway Environmental Commission said, you better watch out because you might be getting, river in your basement. He showed up and he said, I'm all about this. There's too many mosquitoes in the forest. It's ugly to look at. Oh, I have this tree on my property that I've been trying to get rid of for years, and the developer offered to cut it down for me when he cuts down all the other trees. Right? Both neighbors commented on the fact that this wooded area was used as a dump. There was a lot of refuse and trash that was tossed there. And we don't want to be looking at this. We want to just clean the whole thing up. Let's put some beautiful condos there, and we won't have to worry about trash that we got to look at. Now, impact on the community. If you remember these criteria that I talked about for awarding variances. Now, I will, for the record, I voted against Pine Street. And I interrogated the professionals, fairly intensely as to some of my concerns about the development. The majority of the board was not with me, and the development passed. Right, but community comments were something that swayed some of the other commissioners. Because again, what is our responsibility as people who hold positions of public trust in the community? It's to make sure that the interests of the neighbors, the interests of the community are not negatively impacted. Now, yeah, I can go and I can say, well, I've got more experience doing this. I have to take a class in land use law. I've seen a bunch of these different applications. I've got, all this fancy education that I'm bringing to the table. So maybe I know a little bit better than somebody who's just coming in and just thinking about it in terms of, oh, they're going to cut down this tree that I hate, right? But still, it's not my community. And the input from the community has to be factored in. And the community seemed to support, or at least didn't oppose, this development. Now, contrast that with Elm Avenue. 9 members of the community showed up to attend that last hearing. During the audience participation portion of the meeting, went on for about 45 minutes. These 9 community members came up to speak out intelligently against this development. Right. One of them talked about how, well, we haven't seen any questions about remediation. We haven't seen an expert's report. There's been formaldehyde being used in that building for embalming purposes, all these other chemicals. Has there been an environmental survey to make sure that nothing in the ground is contaminated? If the developer was serious about this, maybe he would have done this work. There was a lot of talk about the developer's shortcomings, his failure to maintain the property. There were a couple of people who talked about how the backyard of that funeral home was a trash dump. Sounds a little bit familiar, right? There was an old dilapidated food truck. There was another car up on blocks. There was a lot of just general debris there. And the developer, the property owner, had not done anything about this. And how can we trust him to have our interests in mind if he's not maintaining his own property? Which is certainly something that one of the residents nearby Pine Street could have said. Why is this developer allowing these properties to be full of trash? Why is he allowing his properties to be used as dumps? You know, shouldn't he be responsible for that? Very different perspective on this, right? These 2 groups of people approached these developments differently. In fact, one of the professionals that I had interrogated particularly harshly during the Pine Street application, who was there testifying on behalf of the Pine Street applicant, actually showed up at the Elm Street hearing as a resident to argue against the development. And I was biting my tongue because this particular professional was making some of the same arguments that I was told the year before didn't make any sense. We'll touch on that idea a little bit later also. Excuse me. But this brings me to this next question, right? Neighborhoods versus communities. We use these words sort of interchangeably, but there really is something of a difference between them, right? Deborah Martin wrote in 2003 that proximity fosters common experiences of problems and thus common interests, but location does not in itself make a community, right? So just because we're neighbors, just because we happen to live in the same area, doesn't necessarily mean we're a community. Sure, we've got common interests. When a bunch of leaves in the autumn get left over the storm drain and the water backs up down the street, this impacts all of us. And we're all going to get irritated about it. We're all going to write nasty letters to City Hall, right? One of us might even take it upon ourselves to get a rake and, clean the storm grate off. But beyond that, that's all it is. We've got these problems in common. A community, on the other hand, and this is a definition that comes from John Logan and Harvey Mollick in 1987. They talk about a shared interest in overlapping use values, identity, security, and so on within a single area. Right? It's not just about the geography. Mollick is approaching, his work as an urban sociologist from a Marxist perspective. So, for those of you who don't remember Marx from back in the ancient times of your gen ed classes at university, Marx actually talks about how there are 2 different types of value that distinguish the people who use commodities and the people who sell them, right? Use value is the value that one can get out of an object. Exchange value is the value that object has in a marketplace, right? The capitalist is just interested in use value, right? I mean, if if you're an investor, I don't care what you invest in. You could invest in real estate, stocks, bonds, baseball cards. Doesn't really make any difference. If you're just doing it for the sake of investment, all you care about is when's the right time for me to flip this. So I've got more money coming in. I can then turn around and put that to something that's going to make me more money, right? Use value is very different, right? Buying a home as an investment that you're going to rent out and eventually sell down the road is different from buying the home you're going to inhabit, the home in which you're going to live. That's use value. When I explain this to my students, I always bring a rock to class, just a big rock that I picked up, off the street. Sometimes it's a broken piece of concrete. And I say, all right, what will you give me for this rock? And they don't want nothing to do with it. They're like, I don't know. If you pay me, I'll take it off your hands, right? And I say, okay, how does that answer change if I let a hungry tiger into the classroom, right? Now y'all wish you had my rock, right? Bash the kitty over the head, keep him away from you. Make somebody else eat your lunch, right? But that's the difference between use value and exchange value, right? For Moloch and Logan, right? Community is when we actually have overlapping interests in the way we're going to use that property, right? So if everybody on your block, and again, as some of the new members are being introduced, it was a lot of, oh, this is my neighbor, right? He's very active in the community, right? The fact that you would be close enough to someone to propose him for membership to an organization, of which you are a member, says something about this connection that you have, right? The fact that there is an interest in security. I mean, this is where you get your community watch, right? This is where, you look after your neighbor's property if they go on vacation, right? If you've got somebody living a block or two down from you who has an accident, who's getting a little bit older and can't take care of some basic maintenance, maybe you help them out with that, right? You mow their lawn for them, you rake their leaves, you shovel their snow, you do whatever it is that you have to do to sort of help them out. Now, you're not doing that because you're getting paid. You're doing it because you have this shared sense of connection with this other person in your neighborhood. You don't just see them as a neighbor, you see them as part of your community, right? So, all that having been said, what is a social movement? It seems like an abrupt shift of gears, right? But I'll bring this back around. So, according to Tarot, social movements are collective challenges by ordinary people to the power of elites or authorities. Right? They are mobilized around some sort of a common purpose, and they exist in response to changes in political opportunities or threats. Right? So if there's an opportunity for your group to achieve some positive gain, you might mobilize around that. If there is suddenly a threat to your group, you might mobilize around that too. Right? Social movements are driven by what we call, and scholars of social movements refer to as repertoires of contention, right? There are certain actions that are available to groups seeking to challenge elite power, right? These are not just the things that they can do, but they are the things that they know how to do and the ways that they know how to do them. Right. So again, put yourself into this position. If there was something going on in your community that you were absolutely opposed to, right, and you wanted to do something to challenge this development, whether it was something that your municipality was doing, the mayor, the council was pushing forward some initiative, they were raising taxes, they were cutting services, they were doing whatever it was that they were going to do, and you wanted to challenge it, you're going to go to a certain playbook, right? There are certain tools that we all understand. We've seen them in social movements throughout history that are our go-to instruments when we want to mobilize people, right? So we pull these from these repertoires. Now, excuse me, these repertoires are a direct reflection of the social structure, right? As the structure of society changes, repertoires of contention change to mirror them. So, I want to reference Putnam, right? And Putnam talks about how there is this decline in participation in community organizations. You have less people joining organizations like this, less people joining the Lions Club, less people joining the VFW, less people joining bowling leagues, right? Now, if we wanted to mobilize people, we might form an organization and start trying to hold rallies, hold meetings, do whatever it was we were going to do. We would take minutes. We'd have a treasury because people would pay dues, and we would put those dues monies towards achieving our objectives. That might have worked in the 50s and the 60s, when society was structured around participation in these organizations. Joining another organized group made sense. But as Putnam argues, that's not the way things work today, right? We are much more likely to be free agents. We're much more likely to do things alone. And there is this decline in participation in these larger social groups, right? So there are 4 theories of collective action that are discussed by social movement scholars, right? 4 different perspectives that we might consider: resource mobilization, collective identity, political process, and collective behavior. I don't want to get into the weeds about this. It's not relevant to our talk, but I do want to focus on 2 that are relevant to the way in which people responded to these pine and elm developments, right? First, resource mobilization perspective. Right? As articulated by McCarthy and Zald, resource mobilization focuses on how grievances between the powerful and the powerless are natural. Right? The powerful want to do things, they want to get their way, and they get irritated when all of these little people obstruct the wheels of progress. Right? The powerless don't like to be stepped on. Right? The presence of these inequalities is not enough to mobilize a social movement. They require resources, and therefore they require some sort of organization, right? So a social movement organization, again, according to McCarthy and Zald, is a complex or formal organization which identifies its goals with the preferences of a social movement or a counter movement and attempts to implement those goals, right? So it's not just we're interested in civil rights, right? I can be all about civil rights, equality for people, regardless of race, creed, or color. But that's just me. I can join the NAACP, right? During the civil rights movement, you had the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, and the Congress for Racial Equality. All of these were instrumental organizations in advancing the cause of civil rights in the 1950s and the 1960s. Right? They had officers, they had budgets, dues, minutes, all the things that you would expect from a functioning organization. You join them and you got your marching orders, right? Groups of allied SMOs, like the constellation I just described, represent a social movement industry, right? So this pursuit for civil rights, you have all these allied organizations working to achieve the same objective. How this relates to the types of development issues that we've been discussing, I refer you to the Joint Committee to Stop the Lower Manhattan Expressway. All right. Back in the 1950s, the power broker himself, Robert Moses, the King of New York, after several very aggressively pursued transformations to the structure of the city, set his sight on creating what was called the Lower Manhattan Expressway. This would have been a highway that would have connected the Manhattan and the Williamsburg bridges to the Holland Tunnel. Right? This forked highway would have cut right through Lower Manhattan, through the neighborhoods of Little Italy, through Greenwich Village. In fact, Washington Square Park would have been demolished to make room for this highway. Now, this organization, it was originally formed as the Committee to Save Washington Square Park, was formed in the 1950s to oppose this highway, and they were successful. In June of 1968, the city of New York agreed that Washington Square Park was going to be safe. They were not going to put a highway through it. It would be closed to vehicle traffic for forever. Right? But the organization continued. Right? The woman in that photo is Jane Jacobs, who was one of the founding mothers of urban planning, despite the fact that she wasn't actually a licensed planner. And she was very active in bringing people together around these organizations. Moses kept coming back throughout the 60s for another attempt to make this highway. Eventually, the last boss of Tammany Hall, actually a guy named Carmine DeSpiro, was a resident of Greenwich Village, and he became involved in this campaign. Finally, 1969, Mayor John Lindsay is running for re-election. And part of his re-election campaign is to announce that Lomex is dead forever, right? Because there was just so much resistance to it. It didn't matter what form it took. Some variation on this joint committee was always there, disrupting public meetings, filing public records requests, continually trying to gum up the wheels to slow progress and making an issue out of this, right? This is that resource mobilization argument, right? If you want to stop development in your community that you're not a fan of, you form an organization, you elect officers, and you mobilize around that issue. But this is the old way. Might have worked in the 1950s and the 1960s, but as Putnam describes, world's changed. Society has changed. And so therefore, strategies as part of this repertoire of contention have to change along with it. For this, I refer you to something that's called the collective identity perspective. This is that other perspective on social movement studies that I had indicated. Articulated by Snow and Gamson, they argue that grievances between the powerful and the powerless are subject to different interpretations, right? And social movements have to generate favorable interpretations. So it's all about the spin, right? To use a word that we're probably a little bit more familiar with. Interpretations capable of mobilizing participation are created through these collective action frames. And what is a collective action frame? Right. This comes from the work of sociologist Irving Goffman in Frame Analysis, where he talks a lot about how the way that we frame problems influences the way we understand them. Collective action frames that are going to mobilize people need to be action-oriented sets of beliefs, right? And they have to inspire and legitimate social movement activities. According to Gamson, there are three key components. They have to speak to some sort of injustice. They have to imply agency on the part of individuals to do something about this injustice. And finally, they have to allow for the creation of a shared identity, a we who will stand together in opposition to them, right? So how did this work in terms of what I'm referring to as the Elm Avenue Coalition, right? How we form these place-based collective action frames, right? Again, this is pulling from the work of Deborah Martin. Place-based collective action frames, like the one employed by the Elm Street folks, described common experiences among people in a place, as well as imagining an ideal of how the neighborhood ought to be, right? You shouldn't have trash and debris in this property, right? You shouldn't have some developer who's coming in to just cram 1 million people into the space that's across the street from, where I live. I invested in my property. Keep it looking nice. All these renters are not going to look after the property the way I would. We don't want to have this mass, dense collection of folks living here, right? It's not fair. Agency, right? We shape ideas about places and thereby facilitate social action at the hyper-local level. What do I mean by hyper-local, right? When you're just focused on the block, on the community, on the neighborhood, you can even point to your city council, right? To your mayor. And you can say, yeah, those people don't have our backs, right? The city is part of the problem because they're not standing strong enough. We've got to challenge this zoning commission because they are tools of the city. The city might have an interest in development, but we don't, right? And we can do something about it. We may not be able to change things on the national level, but you can be damn sure we'll be heard if we go to these city council meetings, right? If we stop by the mayor's office hours, if we attend these zoning board meetings, right? Finally, this idea of identity, right? These frames create a discursive place identity that situates and legitimates activism. Right? Now, what do I mean by this? When we talk about things that are discursive, it's rhetorical, right? It's the way that we think about it. It's us, the community, friends, neighbors, people who have this shared interest against them, right? Those outside developers, those people who only have this interest in the exchange value of this property, they're not going to live there. They're not interested in what the day-to-day life would be like for the people in the community, right? So we can form this frame around that. Now, so what, right? What are the implications of this? I'm going to bring this back around to talking about pine and elm. So first of all, there is this issue of Nimbyism versus local control. Right? Nimbyism is sort of this derisive term that originated in the early 80s about people who wanted certain services, but did not want them in their backyards, right? NIMBY being an acronym for not in my backyard, right? Union County's incinerator discussion in the late 80s and the early 90s, for those of you who may remember that, where's the incinerator going to be sited, right? All of Union County was interested in having some place where we could dispose of our trash locally. We just didn't want it too local. This is an issue near and dear to my heart because Rahway, of course, is where that incinerator ended up, right? So yes, in my backyard, right? But here's the thing about this. There is something to be said for how things like garbage incinerators, landfills, power plants get sited, right? Where do highways go? We all want highways, but we don't, and we want to have them accessible, but not too accessible. As a general rule, capital, right? Wealth, connections, the ability to understand how to argue for or against issues is what winds up determining where these things get sited. And consequently, all too often, these undesirable utilities or amenities end up in poor neighborhoods, right? End up in some sort of disenfranchised communities, right? And that's not fair, right? But at the same time, you do want to give people some sort of level of local control over what goes on in their community. You do want people to take agency about the places where they live. So this difference between what's going on with pine versus elm, yeah, the Elm Street residents took initiative. The one professional, I think, exhibited some level of Nimbyism. Oh yeah, the density's fine, just not in my backyard. But they took control over this, right? The Pine Street folks, well, they took control of it too. They made an argument for what they wanted. And just because it was different from what some other people thought, myself included, would be the best way to use or develop that property, that it might not be the place of these boards to be able to say that against the will of the community. Now, this business about constructing these frames and building these community coalitions is a double-edged explanation. Right? It not only explains what happened with Elm Street. There was one particular resident who attended every one of those preliminary meetings. Every time it was canceled, he was back there the next week. He was posting on the community Facebook page. He was going door to door, talking to his neighbors, making sure people knew and understood. Right? Didn't form an organization, but he helped frame the way people thought about that. The developer for Pine Street did something similar. The reason why nobody in the community showed up to protest is because he had spoken to all the members of the community. He'd gone to their doors and he'd said, what do I need to do to have you sign off on this? Here's all the wonderful things that I'm going to do for you, right? You don't like that tree? I'll cut it down when I cut down all the other ones, right? You don't like the fact that this is a trash heap on my property that I'm not doing anything about? Well, don't worry. When these condos are built, it'll be clean. It'll be beautiful. Look at this beautiful graphic rendering that I'm going to provide so you can see how much better what you're going to be looking at is going to be, right? He was able to construct a frame. And I keep coming back to that issue of trash because this is the same problem. Both sites were considered blighted by people in the community, but the way that blight was framed was different. In one circumstance, it was framed as the responsibility of the developer, the property owner. In the other circumstance, it was framed as a problem that the developer would come in as a white knight to solve for the other members of the community, right? So you could sort of see how this business about framing in these local areas, how we're going to think about these ideas can cut both ways. And consequently, it becomes a tool for both developers and for residents, right? These repertoires of contention, which I mentioned earlier, once they're articulated, they're out there, right? One of the big revolutionary strategies of the civil rights movement back in the 60s was to nationalize interest in local law enforcement. And this was an active strategy by King and the rest of the leadership. The Birmingham campaign, by way of example, was chosen in part because they knew Bull Connor would make a star of himself on the front pages of newspapers around the country, right? And this would get the rest of Americans, people who are living in other parts of the country, places where you don't have this type of segregation, to stand up and say, this is wrong. We got to do something about it. Mr. Eisenhower, you have to send the 101st Airborne to Little Rock to integrate those schools, right? Because what those local communities are doing is not acceptable. Now, at the risk of, stepping on, one of the modern day third rails of American politics, that exact same strategy is used by gun rights advocates, right? You've got laws, someplace like New Jersey, that heavily restricts concealed carry rights, right? This is not an issue of local control. This is an active organization coming in and saying, an organized movement coming in and saying, we need to step in and intervene in what's going on in this local community, right? Their laws are not fair. And if we have to have federal intervention to change them, to make them more fair, that's what we're going to do, right? So having an awareness of how to mobilize people in an age where community organizations may not necessarily be the most effective way to get people out there, is a tool that can be used by people who want to organize in favor of or opposed to any of these different types of developments. And again, you can take this and you can apply it more broadly to really any sort of movement. So that's my spiel. I hope I have not gone on too terribly long, but I would like to open things up if there's any questions, thoughts, or anything else. Oh, I see a bunch of hands popping up online.
No. Here.
And again, I will trust the intrepid tech crew to make sure all the people who are online get taken care of.
Yeah, question. What
Sure.
you didn't discuss is the effect of development on a community in general. By that I mean schools, roads, density, all this other stuff. Is that even relevant at these meetings? Thank you.
It's relevant to people who are told that it's relevant. And that's the correct answer to the question. Interestingly, in that Pine Street development, one neighbor who came and this was not the guy who lived on Wall Street, which was in danger of being flooded. This was another resident, lived a block away. He stood up and he said, I'm 100% in support of this development. I think that this is a wonderful idea. I want to get rid of this blight. The city also needs to do something about traffic. Okay, well, dude, what do you think is going to happen when you put 14 families on that tiny little stretch of woods? When you're adding school kids, when you're adding commuters, when you're adding people going to the grocery store, what do you think is going to happen to traffic on your street? It's going to increase. But that's not the way that it was framed. In the Elm Street case, because it was members of the community who were framing it, parking was actually one of the big things that they talked about. Where are all these people going to park? Where are they going to park? There's not enough parking already. So because they were primed to think about it that way, that's the way they thought about it. All right. Does that answer your question? Awesome. Who else do we have?
Online?
Okay. Yes, that was a wonderful talk. I love the way you connected zoning to civil participation. However, we had a situation in my neighborhood in Watchung where there were similar things that one neighbor wanted to split his property. It was a very small piece of property, and build a McMansion on the very other section. So, and another one that was on a hill, and they wanted to take one house and make it into 4 houses, which was a problem because of we thought because of the water. So the neighbors got together, we got lawyers, we did what seemed like all the right things, and the zoning board still said, well, they can build that stuff. So my feeling is the zoning boards are in the pockets of the developers.
I'm sorry, John, but to address your question, one, I will not take that personally as a member of a zoning board. But I think that there's 2 components to this. One, sometimes your hands are tied when you're on the zoning board based on what is or is not allowed, and more specifically, what sorts of precedents have been established by other developments elsewhere in the community. Because if I say, yeah, you want this variance for this thing, and the community is against it, but we've allowed this a dozen other times over the last couple of years in other parts of the community, what's going to happen is that applicant is going to turn around, lawyer up, they're going to sue the city, and they're going to request to have the zoning decision overturned. So sometimes I may not like the application, but I kind of, I know that it's going to be approved because other things like this have been approved in the past and are consistently approved. So that's one element of it. 2, again, letting those zoning commissioners understand, making this into something that is not just, I'm going to hire a lawyer and I'm going to go to a meeting. I'm going to have a couple of people who are going to sit in the back and not say anything. Having that room packed. When you open it up for public comment, and public comment is required at all these public meetings, right? When you open that up, if you've got a line of people backed up and you just hold that board in session, eventually you got to answer to the people. Zoning commissioners are generally appointed by the mayor, approved by the city council. If you don't like what your zoning board is doing, you need to be, especially in election time, going and talking to your councilman. When somebody comes knocking on your door asking for your vote, well, what are you going to do about zoning? We got to have people who are more friendly to residents, less friendly to developers on our zoning board. You do that, you get my vote. So yes, some of the things I've described are an important first step, but that's all they are, right? Effective social movement-based campaigns, attempts to bring people together to push for and advocate for particular changes that you want to see in your community cannot just be one and done. There has to be that consistent pressure. John, I hope I answered that question for you.
Yes, that you did. And does that have anything to do with the density law that went into where you have to have so many low income houses?
Bill, I see you there. There he is.
Yeah, but John asked a follow-up question. John, you want to repeat it?
Yeah, I just wondered if that had anything to do with the low density, that you have to have so many lower income houses per town.
Yeah, you're talking about the Abbott the Abbott districts, right?
Yes.
Yeah, I'm sorry. Mount,
Yes.
The Mount Laurel decisions. So the deal with that is, what exactly does low income mean? And developers seem to have a very different definition of what that is than other people. The Pine Street project, for example, was advertised. It was argued as low income accessible housing. Well, one of the questions I actually asked the developer was, okay, well, if it's low income, what do you plan to charge? Well, we're thinking 399. Now, I don't know about any of y'all, but $400,000 does not strike me as low income friendly entry level homes. And I mentioned this to the developer, and he says, well, you know, if you get rid of some of the bedrooms, make them smaller units, you know, they would, you know, lower price might be reasonable. He says, well, then I'm not going to make money that way. So when you talk about low density, there's a difference between low density and low income. Low density is having fewer units, fewer residents in a particular geographic space. Low income is having properties that are accessible to people who are at different points in their life course, who have different economic situations. Obviously, if you're mid-career, you're in your 40s, you've outgrown the condo that you bought, you know, with your first job, you're trying to move someplace with a family, you might want to move into someplace that's going to be larger and more expensive. But you have to have access to that reasonably priced first home so you can start building equity. And that's one of the reasons why having lower priced accessible properties is important for a community. If all you have are properties for people who are mid-career, who are already economically comfortable, you're mutilating your community in a way. You're making it very exclusive to only a certain group of people, and you're cutting it off from these younger folks, right? Younger folks bring something different to a community. It's a generational argument, but there's also this idea of energy, right? Younger people are more likely to be more engaged, to have more energy. If you price them out of the community, you shouldn't be surprised if the institutions in the community, if participation in the community is on the decline. So that's, John, that's what I'd say to that. Again, I hope I've addressed your question.
Yes, thank you.
Bill, did you have a further question?
Yeah, I did. I never got to the question. Rick, a fabulous talk. I'm really interested in this topic because I live in a section of Westfield, and it's a lovely section that was developed in the 1920s. It's a big area. It must be 100 homes. They took a big woods and they developed houses, and they were all individual, and they were mixed houses. There were mansions. There were modest 3-bedroom homes, and there are two principles. One was there should be a balance between nature and the buildings, which is lovely, and the other was that there should be not just all big houses. You know, I just love the neighborhood. I've lived here for 30 years, but I've just watched it die, and it died because all the modest homes, builders bought them and blew out to the town. Loved the increased the revenue, the tax money, and on the collective action side, I and others could not get our little community, to agree on anything except I want to get the most from my house when I sell it. If I sell it to a builder, tough patooties, I'm out of here. So I'm very cynical or discouraged. So it's not a big question. It's a problem that is out there. And I thank you very much for serving on the Rahway planning board. They need people like you, because the people I've run into on the planning boards are not my best friends. That's it.
You want to kill that for a second?
Okay, Marv Gersten?
What a great and pertinent presentation, Rick. I'm another Westfield resident, and I have another Westfield development story. Right now, there's a project being proposed by the former owners of the Lord and Taylor site in Westfield. And they are proposing adding 310,000 square feet of office development, plus 6-level office buildings along the former ground level parking spots along the railroad, along the Raritan line, calling it transit-oriented development. And there is an advocacy group that has just been formed called WARD, Westfield advocates for responsible development. So all of the community activities and concerns about this project, which we feel is overdevelopment of a beautiful downtown area, is up for a discussion, opposition. There's a town council meeting tonight where the developers are presenting their latest proposal with their traffic consultants and their planning consultants. And I'm going to appear there and talk about my critique of their traffic impact report. So this is so pertinent to what your presentation was about, particularly in terms of the kinds of community organizations that can rally around their concerns. So thank you for the presentation.
So to address what Marv and Bill were saying about Westfield generally, the idea of having these communities where you've got these mansions and you've got these modest homes and you've got this very mixed use and mixed development, that actually goes back to Jane Jacobs' work in her landmark book, Death and Life of the Great American Cities, right? Jacobs argues that this mixed use community is really important. You cannot have just homogeneous enclaves where everybody's the same, everybody's doing the same thing, because you can't build communities that way. The idea is to have different types of people who are interacting in different ways, bumping into each other while they're walking their dog, for example, right? That's how you build the community. If we're all the same, we're not able to make these weak ties that enable us to expand and create these communities. The fact that as time goes by, developers start consolidating these properties, it gets away from what that original idea was for properties like that. Marv, to your question or to your comment as it was, I would bear in mind as you're thinking about how to address this development, coming in and saying, well, yeah, you know, I disagree with your parking study. Okay, that's good and that's valid, but how are you going to convince me, who has a driveway, that I should care about your street parking? Right? It's about figuring out that lever. And again, people argue parking all the time, but it's coming up with a way to take this development in a whole and make this something that the community understands in a way that they are going to want to rally around. Right? If you're trying to press gang people to join an organization, you're trying to push them, get involved. This is important. This is important. This is important. No matter how much you tell me something's important, if I don't feel it, I'm not going to do it. But if you can make this about something where I feel that this does impact me, if I feel that this is an injustice that's directed at me, it becomes a different sort of thing.
Okay. Go ahead.
Is there any other questions in the group here? Online, there were two. DJ, have you got a quickie?
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Thank you also very much. This is much appreciated and very timely talk. I live in Summit, and we've had a mega project planned for the city. And the plan has been going on for at least 2 years. It started just before COVID. And I just want to stress how difficult that this social movement organization that you mentioned, how difficult it is to develop. We have no newspaper in the city. We have internet. People don't read their mail, or people are very difficult to reach. And it took about 2 years for the people of Summit to go to the meetings and, as you said, talk to the council. At first, the council was very belligerent and not listening to the people. So you only have a small group of people opposed, but eventually. But just to make it short. Eventually, a citizen architect came up with a counter plan. And that's what you were saying, Rick, that we have to come with ideas, positive and constructive ideas. And, you know, so thank you for your talk. And I would encourage anybody living in Summit to go to this council meeting and oppose this huge development that will change the face of Summit forever. Thank you very much.
Oh, quick comment?
Very quick.
Oh, in response to that?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I don't really know what I sort of would have to say about that, except, you know, exactly what I had mentioned to Marv. Organizing people is difficult if you don't have a reason for them to want to engage. It's all about the framing. It's all about how you think about that idea. So let's take the last one if there is another. That's it.
Mike Bennett, would you like to come up and thank our speaker?
Austin hearing aids. Richard, thank you so much. As you can see from all the questions, this is a topic that people are extremely interested in. We have a certificate for you here. You see the orchid on there.
Mhm.
Back in 1930, when we were formed, the orchid was was grown in Summit. It was known as the orchid capital of the United States. Interestingly, the last grower left for Georgia in 1975 for low-income housing. And we have the old guard salute. Thank you.